Hello everyone, today we come back to our military historical unit series, this time looking at the armed forces of the Emirate of Granada, the last Islamic stronghold in Iberia, also known as the Nasrid Kingdom. The term obviously is sort of an adaptation to English, which endured from 1238 until its fall to Castile in 1492. I also made a video months ago about the siege of Granada, and sure, at some point we'll come back to it. Today we talk about the 14th century, and in particular at a specific unit featured by the Nazarid army, that is the mounted crossbowmen. Naturally, mounted crossbowmen were very common, actually, and especially across Western, also Central Europe. In the East, surely we find something of this kind as well as in Europe, even though the composite bow is prevalent, right? I already made actually a video, a military historical unit video in particular about, I think it was the 12th to 13th century Western mounted crossbowmen. We discussed the nature of these troops in the art of war panorama of the time. They were more common than we think, including with horse archers proper. Right, the West had them not just sort of more famously during the English chevauchee of the 100 Years' War, but as a general capacity that any mounted fighter at the time, especially the tendentially professional ones, had. Right. In fact, we've seen in that video how mounted crossbowmen, as well as crossbowmen in general, so the foot ones, were normally, especially in a Western context, so we're talking essentially Latin Germanic Europe, across the high and late Middle Ages, were essentially cultivated by different powers, can be kingdoms and with their mercenaries, communes with their soldiers. There isn't actually much of a difference between mercenaries and normal soldiers as soldiers proper, so not as militia, even though those could be paid too or even provided with their own equipment, in maintaining picked units of crossbowmen. For some reason, it's not overwhelmingly easy to understand why that is the case, also because the crossbow was tendentially universalizing in Western Europe in particular. And as such, what we see mostly is that the weapons obviously could exist of different types, of different quality. So even though you have lots of militias that fight with crossbows on a regular basis, and still, if you look at the High Middle Ages, there were lots of bowmen and longbowmen actually across all of Western Europe. The crossbow effectively takes over, but different powers want to maintain a very specific picked pocket, so to say, of professional marksmen, including mounted, right, to be more versatile, even though, again, the mounts do cost, etc. When we look at the Nazarid Emirate, we have to appreciate, of course, the slightly different ethnocultural flavor involved, right? The Nazarid Emirate was centered, as you know, in the city of Granada and ruled by the Nazarid dynasty, relying heavily on innovative military adaptations amid constant pressure from the Christian Reconquista campaigns. Right, you already understand that the frontier in the north, that there is the Sierra Nevada, and in many ways, Granada is enrocked in a very sort of difficult position. Like the 1492 campaign, it was just like the culmination of previous decades, old ones, is one of accessing very specific passes, battling the various castles guarding it. And so it's a broken, disconnected terrain. There is a wide area in the north, in the west, that is still fundamentally permeable to raids, right? Even though the Reconquista was technically over already by the 14th century, because Las Navas brought to the subjection of all these Muslim powers at some point to the different actors, in this case, fundamentally Castile, right? The protagonist of the Reconquista. And so, yes, there were intermittent wars, and also pretty important ones, also some attempts from North Africa to reinvade Spain. But there was always this ambiguity where frontier warfare, guerrilla, hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, etc., were particularly characteristic of Iberian warfare in general, telling you the truth, right? And we will see today, as it is also notorious, that we tend to attribute to the so-called Arabs, regardless of the meaningful Berber injections and the ones of other peoples telling the truth in the previous centuries. And the idea, think about the Carol farce of this kind of hit-and-run tacticals in open field with the fighting a la Uneta, etc., as if, it was simply characteristic of the Muslim world in the East, right? And this is actually correct when you look at the sort of differences, tendentially, between, say, the Castilians at this point, to stick to a very local example, the same Nazarid, right? The Westerners had a heavier, more largely knightly based force with also more heavily armored troops, more heavy infantrymen, next to, however, also the skirmishers, we will say now, whereas, in fact, the Muslims tended to be lighter in relying on hit-and-run tactics exactly because they had to wear out the enemy, a bit like what we've seen with the Turks and the Mongols in the East, before they can actually send in a shock force capable of, very often also not necessarily capable of breaking the enemy heavier array, right? But first of all, we look at Iberian warfare in general, we must say that since antiquity, the Spaniards had been fighting like that. We've seen it in many videos about Celtiberian history and warfare. I have a series ongoing on the Roman conquest of Spain for that matter. But when we look at the Nazarid kingdom in particular, right, this western and, in this sense, northwesternmost emirate of the Islamic world, we realize, and there are very interesting comparisons to this, that the Nazarids fought in ways that were almost indistinguishable, and truly virtually indistinguishable, if not by degree, like by quantity, from the ones of the Westerners. And this includes, by the way, the adoption also of Western arms and armor, and the crossbow here is somehow an indicator of that, provided like that, of course, the Islamic world had been using crossbows historically, just like in the West. There was definitely in the broader Muslim world a greater use of bows, especially when you look at North Africa, and so with this continuous connection, by the way, that existed across the Strait of Gibraltar, with different war bands making back and forth. And so also the tendentially tribal interland, right? The various waves of the Almoravids, of the Almohads had at some point like brought in soldiers as far as from Black Africa, right? Tended to have this sort of more primitive, but also in many ways effective approach. We've seen, for example, I think it was the Third Battle of Ramla in the Holy Land, where in the 12th century, it's some Sudanese infantry in the Fatimid army that holds its ground all the day long, eventually ending up broken, admittedly, against Frankish heavy cavalry with combined armed tactics of longbowmen and spearmen, right? And again, you know these things, I presume, in general. I don't need to repeat myself on the longbow was used by pretty much everybody. And then again, the introduction of the crossbow is something that makes sense in many ways, that perhaps just like the English victories of the 100 Years' War may have obfuscated a bit, even though they literally had nothing to do with the longbow versus any other missile weapon. Had they used crossbowmen, it would have been the same identical thing. There is literally, again, no proof whatsoever that there was anything different, even in there between the English or the French in any radical way, and surely also not, especially material culture, technological capacity. Actually, the longbow is fundamentally a less sophisticated weapon for that matter compared to the crossbow, especially once used, I don't know, by the Genoese. Again, the range could be really of crossbows, not the actual shooting range, I mean the range of different types, could be really wild. So when we look at Nazarid equipment, you realize that this power had naturally developed like some more effective countermeasures against Western arms and armor, right? The mounted crossbowman, in this sense, resembles much more the practice of the Westerners, as opposed to some, for example, jinete that was still used by the Spaniards in general, that were, in this sense, sort of straddling a blurred frontier with the Islamic military culture. And that, in fact, would be mostly sort of javeliners, mounted javeliners, or even archers at some point, right? So the reason why I make a video like this is just like for this military historical unit series, like how much could you even say just about the 14th century Granadine mounted crossbowman, right? You could make this video in 5 minutes. Now there are specific iconographic and historiographical sources in which we can base ourselves to say, look, this thing even literally existed. In fact, the guy that I sort of inserted here in the pictures is for the same iconography as we will see now of the specific source where it comes from, derives from it in very, again, precise ways. So also my use of AI at this point is very proper, as you will see as we continue our work here. We don't make too many videos about military historical unit types, but they are important, right? And they tell you a lot about the material culture in particular of these peoples, but it's never just about that. It's understanding why a unit like this can be characteristic of this specific context, right? Albeit being used conceptually as mounted crossbow and pretty much across a much wider area, right, at this point. Now, contemporary historical accounts make it evident that crossbows were a frequent armament for Granadine horsemen. From the outset of the century, the prominent Andalusian polymath, poet, historian, and vizier, Lisan al-Din ibn al-Khatib, 1313-1374, a key intellectual figure whose works include detailed histories of Granada, inscribed even on Alhambra walls, by the way. That's why we know you're relevant, in local historiography, observed that what locals termed the quote-unquote Frankish bow, meaning the crossbow, often labeled as, in fact, foreign or Christian influence, had surpassed the traditional Arab bow in popularity among Granada's inhabitants, right? So we have this pretty explicit statement where we're told that this fundamentally, from a Muslim perspective, exotic weapon had, because it was associated with the Franks historically, with the Christians, had become fundamentally more important than the traditional bow, right? That was used in Granada, in the Nasrid realm, right? As we said, again, bows were potentially more common than crossbows in the Islamic world and in this country. And they had been up to basically around al-Khatib's time. Otherwise, he would have not made the statement, by the way. Writers active in this era, such as Ibn al-Labana and Ibn Udayl, full name Abu al-Sam Ali ibn Abd ar-Rahman al-Farazi al-Andalusi, by the way, a 14th century Andalusian military theorist and Furziya expert. That's essentially an expert of chivalry, sort of the Islamic way to knighthood. In fact, whose treatise, the Ilat al-Fursan wa Shiar al-Suyan, details equestrian combat and weaponry. And in particular, the latter, Ibn Udayl, produced his work towards the later period, like in the 1390s, for the Nasrid ruler Muhammad VI al-Ghalib Billah, who reigned briefly in this time, in the late 14th century, amid dynastic turmoil, which was heavily undermining and crippling the the Nasrid state, that otherwise was a power to be reckoned with. I don't remember if we already made, I think, something about the Granadine army organization, but I think I talked mostly about we talked about, if anything, the medieval Andalusian warfare from the Almoravids to the Nazarids, right? When we observed how actually powerful the Nazarid kingdom really was. It was actually saved by the struggles, internecine struggle between Christians, among Christians in the north, right? Because, they would have not had much capacity to stand their own ground otherwise. But they had pretty big armies to begin with. And so we're looking really at a power that reached important levels of military sophistication. And in both these sources, in any case, we mentioned here, described riders from Granada carrying the very crossbows, the Frankish bow that al-Din ibn al-Khatib had described. So we are aware that more or less by this time, indeed, the crossbow was an important element of Granadine horsemen in particular, right? Which is particularly, again, fitting the general skirmishing guerrilla frontier between the Christian and Islamic world, but also a level of tendential advancements in military technology and, in an anachronistic term, we could say doctrine, where the Ansari regime strikes also the Islamic world in many ways. And so the idea, again, that there are less troops, but more professional. This is the age of the soldiers of fortune, of the mercenary companies, all that kind of stuff, actually emerges from here more. And so you have more picked and specialized units of tendentially smaller armies that, however, are increasingly compact, better organized, right? Because less people are actually participating to warfare than before, and there is an attempt in the wake of the great late medieval crisis to rationalize resources expenditure, and the fact that the crossbow at this point, in particular towards the later 14th century, there is a resurgence normally in terms of military organization from the deep crisis in the decades immediately following the Black Death, speaks of this functional necessity of the mounted crossbow and as a versatile fighter, right? As we will see now, here, for example, the guy does not have a secondary weapon like a sword, but there could be, so we will talk about that for completion. By the way, I added also the famous Granadine sword here to describe a little bit, because when I make this military historical unit series, like the challenge at some point is also to cover can't cover infinite types of troops, like it would become sort of psychoticals, because again, in the fundamentals, like we're talking in the Middle Ages, there weren't infinite types of troops, right? Conceptually, concretely, here what matters, we're talking about a mounted crossbow, and then if we acquaint you with the sort of with this source or another, is for the sake of broader, again, historical completion, of color, of, say, just knowing what kind of sources you can use if you want to properly access the Middle Ages, right? And so you have to put together sometimes, like, the different weapons. Also, if there isn't much of a broader connection in the specific iconographic source where you take them from. But that's also importantly the variety of sort of combinations that you can put together, right? Now, into the 15th century, Granadine crossbow expertise earned broad acclaim, right? The Castilian royal secretary and chronicler Hernando del Pulgar, 1436, roughly 1492, who documented the Granada War under Ferdinand and Isabella, los Reyes Católicos, and participated in key events like the siege exploit. I also made a video about Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba that also distinguished himself in this incident. So you understand how sort of close this mounted crossbowmen of the Nasrid kingdom were to things like even Renaissance warfare, right? These types of troops were kept being used for an important while, even in Europe, even in North Africa, even more, right? So this this author was among Hernando del Pulgar various Christian chroniclers who lauded the remarkable accuracy displayed by these Granadine mounted crossbowmen, pointing out that instruction in the weapon's handling commenced during childhood, right? So not just an important technological, I mean, again, the crossbow is not a novelty by this point in history, but its development, its handling, like the necessity to perform increasingly against, at this point, like we are in the single most heavily armored context in the history of mankind, like infantry, troops-wise in general. And so consider that these crossbows were to be used against very often heavily armored opponent, right? Mostly like the Christians. Again, the Muslims were socially segmented in ways that would actually make them feel slightly sort of less armored forces. But again, as we said, for the Nazarid kingdom, you would have seen, and we will talk about this in other types of troops, because there is also, I don't know, the Nazarid heavy cavalry is very interesting to describe, would have looked really incredibly similar across the frontier, right? It would have been very difficult if you at least are not particularly knowledgeable in heraldry to distinguish a sort of Spanish, a Christian warrior from a Nazarid Islamic one. Aside from the fact that there were troops from sort of both sides that fought with one another. That's why I made a historical military units video for the Mudejar that were fighting for the Christians at this point, as much as, and we've seen it in other videos, like Christian guards fighting for the same Nazarids at some point, right? As it was also very typical across the religious board. At the same time, these weapons are also relatively available in many ways. And so being trained to use it from childhood, especially sort of, for example, let's imagine an operational, tactical context where this would have come handy. As we've seen, lots of passes, lots of mountainous terrain. So actually cavalry is not that good, but we're talking missile, right? And so missile troops do not have a battle formation. Like they're fighting in loose order. They can act a bit as, Steinbocks, like mountain goats, and jump around on difficult terrain, shooting, harassing, by sort of peppering the enemy troops as they advance. Maybe literally exploiting gravitational acceleration from passes, from gorges, setting up ambushes, and inflicting actually devastating damage even to some of the better armored troops around, right? Even one mountain goat, in this sense, if it catches you out there in the open from a higher altitude and shoots at you, it's not going to be fun at all, right? And so given that it was an increasingly defensive need, especially Hernando del Pulgar, as we've seen here, dies around the same final victory, Christian victory in the conquest of Granada, would have witnessed to this firsthand. There would have been a great deal of defense from the side of the population. There were pretty tough, encounters, sieges, right? At some point, the Christians also rendered the honor of the arms to some defeated Muslims had resisted basically till the end in certain strongholds. It's actually an incredibly bitter campaign, an incredibly unforgiving one, right? Where, the distractions, this, again, necessity to have raiding parties, fast, agile, and so equipped also for shooting at range, because that's fundamentally what missile troops are. They're lighter, right? So they're not ideally suited for hand-to-hand combat, if not against other light troops, but they have fundamentally to get the hell out of the way if there is a more heavily armored opponent that can and will actually chase them. The idea that if you're simply light, you can't thus elude any enemies is actually a myth, right? It doesn't work like this, especially when we talk about actual units out there, right? Crossbow armed infantry constituted the core of Granada's foot forces from an early stage, because again, they were very Western-like, and so there were lots of bowmen as well. But if you had looked at the entire Islamic world, these guys looked very Christian, militarily speaking. It's a bit like, I don't know, think about the Turks during the Ottoman era, that for us, obviously, in the West, like, were pretty light looking, pretty sort of oriental looking. But if you had compared them fighting in Mesopotamia against the Safavid Persians, well, it's the latter that would have looked actually much more like a very Eastern army, and still a tendentially more primitive and sort of medieval one than the sort of at least heavily firearm shooting Ottomans with lots of heavy artillery and so on. All right, so this is a bit the same picture, right? Without mentioning again that there were lots of light troops among the Christian Spanish in particular, just by regional historical military tradition. And you had this local, properly Iberian Islamic force, armed infantry drawn from normally, as we've seen also from the Mudayyars, from these essentially third estate strata of the population, from the local guilds, from the men that literally produced these weapons to begin with, and knew also how to handle them. So it would have come from the same Granada, very important towns in the Nasrid kingdom, next to Berber volunteers that were drawn from also North Africa in search as mercenaries of pay in this important center, that were lighter instead and made much less use of crossbows. They were something a bit more technically sophisticated and technically also easier to use, like in terms of sort of more conventional, straightforward, for example, defending the castles, the fortifications, where the Berbers, it's not like they were dumber, but they were more flexible in different contexts, right? Even though they were very light and not as, for example, heavily equipped, even as missile troops with protection for defense, than the Nazarid, but they were in this sense more agile. They needed weapons that could be more adaptable to many situations that the bow can provide you with, including, for example, shooting at a faster rate in certain circumstances. Now, you can't actually shoot a bow as laying down, right? Whereas a crossbowman can, fundamentally. The Berbers were, as you know, indigenous North African groups long involved in Iberian Islamic armies at this point since the Umayyad conquests. In fact, the Umayyad conquests had been carried out largely by Berbers, right? They were Arab or Arabized elites back in the 8th century. And we're talking about Charles Martel just a few days ago. But things had not really changed that much in North Africa, right? This Berber tribes from the hinterland had remained wild, habituated to all kind of violence, normally in their cattle raiding, etc. And so they could and would sort of go out there and fight. It's like, say, I don't know, the Welsh in the English armies, right? Why were they there? There's no specific reason. It's not like the Welsh, big myth that we like to debunk all the time, were any better or worse, for that matter, than the English archers. But they were hungrier, yeah, and therefore they had less to lose, and they would be more easily enlisted, right, as professional soldiers here and there. This Berbers, thus, in the Nazarid case, provided vital manpower through tribal alliances and volunteer contingents that continuously, and because of the existence probably of the Nazarid realm across the straits from North Africa, probably the necessity of fighting still against the Christians, and so requiring that finding a friendly place where to exercise their craft, so to say. An especially large formation documented in the opening decades of the 14th century comprised 8,000 cavalry supported by 75,000 crossbowmen, which obviously is false, right? And but this included, at least this is important by scale, right? Including up to 50,000, or originating apparently of this 75,000 solely from the Alpujarras range. This was a rugged, mountainous southern region of the Sierra Nevada, known for its Berber-descended populations and strategic defensibility, which supplied large numbers of skilled fighters. This is particularly interesting because this is an interesting dynamic that at some point occurred also in the, for example, during the migration era, with the Germans settling more, so actually in less hospitable places, but more strategically relevant, like some mountain passes, etc. Here it had been a bit the same. The Berbers had been settled in the less civilized areas in the mountains that controlled however, the most important strategic passes, and as military colonists, fundamentally maintaining historically, regardless of the fact that obviously they intermarried with the locals, so they became Spaniards in any case, would pass down like an important military tradition, right? And these, right, were crossbowmen, interesting enough. And so, regardless of the size here, that is naturally implausible, right? No army would have surpassed 50,000 in any properly expandable sense, tactically wise, as a unitary thing. And here we can think that the ratio was much smaller, right? But the interesting thing in absolute terms, there were probably much less also than 50,000, is that up to 2/3 of this entire crossbowman force next to the cavalry were coming from those Alpujarras range areas with all their mountain terrain and skill in defense with this kind of weapons, right? Composite limbed crossbows had by then solidified their position as the chief weapon for foot soldiers. Even though Ibn Udayl argued that the Arab bow suited mounted warriors more effectively, Granadian fighters regularly operated crossbows from horseback, proving that this apparently allogen weapon, again, crossbows existed for a long time, and actually they never really died out from antiquity, where they already existed, actually from classical antiquity, not just the later one. But they were historically associated in their conquista a bit more with the Christians that made larger use of that. So the fact that Ibn Udayl makes that statement, actually it was a bit sort of a problem for him to assess, because he didn't probably like this, the idea that the good old Arab bow had to basically do the work by itself, had to be a workhorse of some sort, was rapidly fading. Aside from the fact that firearms were quite important in the same Nasrid kingdom, and so things were really changing in a eventually and ultimately disastrous, precipitous way for the last Muslim power in the Iberian Peninsula, right? What matters here is, again, the agility, the versatility, the fact that these mounted crossbowmen are really chosen for their effectiveness as a troop type, right? I would like also to stress, now we'll talk a bit about the sort of the expansion of this weapon, different areas, but it's important to stress that Iberian warfare, especially during the High Middle Ages, had been particularly advanced, right? Eventually, regions like France, like Italy, came to be the most technologically advanced. It was already true by this point. But if you look at especially pre-Christian kind of upper hand in the Iberian Peninsula. I just recently made a video about Alfonso VI of Castile, that it is probably like the watershed, like the moment in which the tide is turned in that regard, had been dramatically advanced. There are some arms and armor used by both, predominantly the Muslims, because that seems to have been some sort of broader relic. We don't understand how generalized or how actually widespread, right? But still, of the Islamic Golden Age technological development, right? The Christians in the Iberian Peninsula apparently had this ingenious developments, inventions as well. Some of these designs will be found later, right, in Western Europe, the bassinet, among other things, but also some, for example, steel crossbow that we don't understand where they were created. I discussed this in the videos about Castilian and Catalan warfare for the historical regional warfare series. At this point, however, things had homogenized, and those older experimentations actually had faded, had disappeared. There's a rationalization with the Christian conquest of Spain, where it's the Western, the broader Frankish model that overruns everything, right? But just for saying that the crossbow was not merely, had not really been merely a Western thing, but in the way, of course, it was generalizing at this point in the Nazarid armies. It owes more to that influx, to that tradition, and the general normalization that would have occurred also in the Islamic world in different ways in terms of army, maybe not army organization, because in general, like the Islamic world was heavily shattered by the Reconquista, but in general, like again, the effectiveness, like the necessity, for example, having a type of trooper like this was enhanced, right? While shooting a crossbow while mounted was an uncommon tactic in most regions, it occurred in central areas of Central Europe and proved especially characteristic of Granada across both the 14th and 15th centuries. Yes, because there is this idea that fundamentally Western mounted crossbowmen had historically dismounted to fight, more at least preferentially. They would always fight from horseback. Actually, one thing that is generally underappreciated is how the crossbow was used as a secondary weapon by knights, right? Chivalric literature does not talk about this very much, but it would have been much more frequent than we imagine. And so the idea that the West would make less use of mounted missile troops is correct. But we should think of these mounted crossbowmen to be a bit more active on horseback than we normally think. Because otherwise the idea is that they move fast, they arrive in a certain place, they started harassing castles, whatever tactical employment they had. But it is that it would mostly dismount, because there is a reason that Western warfare was tendentially more foot-based. And so these pockets, again, of mounted crossbowmen were used in a very surgical fashion, right? Otherwise, the same sort of majority of crossbowmen, as this was the case also in the Nazarid kingdom at this point, would have been on foot. They would be normally infantry, all right, not dismounted cavalry, even as footmen. The reason why in Central Europe we see a bit more of Eastern sort of influence in this mounted crossbowmen is something you can appreciate a bit in the borderlands between the Germanic, the Slavic, and the Magyar worlds. Something I will talk more frequently about, but the Italians made use of sort of very wide array of foreign mercenaries at a point. Barbanicchi from the Banate. This is of course, a synecdoche and some sort of distortion of sort of that sort of Italian nickname given to these mercenaries that at some point were a mix. This is especially true during the same 14th century. We'll talk about them at some point, between Germans, but mostly southern Slavs and Magyars, right? And it's similar because naturally the steps begin in those places to what we see for different reasons, the more mounted tradition between North Africa and southern Spain that we appreciate here, right? So the influence is merely anecdotal. It is true that, I don't know, in Islamic Spain, as we were saying before, during the Middle Ages, you could find all things, including literally Central Asian, not even just Middle Eastern influences. Types of stirrups, like some particular weapons, etc. But in this sense, also the connection with Central Europe is very loose for that matter. Still, the steppes had arrived to influence those places. Again, this is not why the Spanish fought like this for that. Again, the fighting in La Gineta finds parallelisms with the Cantabrian tactics of the ancient world, without mentioning Berber warfare. So there's barely anything to do with Central Asian influences. But as we'll see now, there were actually also, Turks employed as far as this areas in the broader Islamic world. You could find, Turkic gulams at some point fighting in Black Africa, like this kind of stuff. Now, the region's use of crossbows had deeper roots, by the way. The handled variety, inherited from late Roman times, endured in Iberia primarily for hunting purposes. Right? This is at least the idea. I talked about the belly bow, the gastrophetes from classical antiquity. Interestingly enough, the Romans were actually among the very first documented people to use them, albeit commissioned to, and in fact received by Hellenic engineers, but mostly to target the Italic strongholds during the Roman conquest of Italy, where in the 4th century BC. It's difficult to tell how widespread these weapons actually were in later times, but late antiquity in particular seems to have made use of it for different reasons. That include probably the idea also of militias needing to defend their fortified strongholds during the barbarian invasions, and similar things. We find, however, also in Pictland, in the darkest of ages, during medieval times, very neatly depicted crossbows. So the idea is that even when we see the resurgence during the 11th century in particular in the hands of Normans, we will see now also how it had gone into Spain. We realize that probably they had always remained there since ever, right? So the idea that the crossbow simply respread, particularly during the 12th, the 13th century, is true by degree, but it's not because the weapon was not there before. It hadn't remained like also one of the many typical weapons that would have existed on the battlefields, right? We'll talk about that stuff as well. I have a military historical unit episode about the 11th century Western Frankish crossbowman that talks about that. So again, the idea that the Iberians would have maintained, this is what Nicole believed, naturally on the basis of informed studies, but it's just mostly hypothetical. Primary hunting purpose is that, as you know, and this will favor the continuity of this weapon also in Muslim hands, the fundamentally intact latifundium system, doesn't matter how shrunk, how reduced, in Visigothic Spain, tended to disarm the peasantry, tended to sometimes arm them as servants, as colonists, as in the hosts along the retinues of the Visigothic dukes, right? They will talk about this as well. But this mostly speaks the language of, and until, in fact, the Taifas collapsed, so leading to, as we'll see now, a refeudalization of the system, so a greater armament, probably spread of crossbow also in southern Spain, in Andalusia, even before the Christians arrived. It is possible that, that it was mostly confined, this weapon was mostly confined, as in different contexts, to some more hunting purpose, or at least it would have been illegal to simply use a crossbow across like the broader peasantry or even certain towns. But even there, we start realizing that probably, again, the weapon was still there, was still particularly, in fact, that the Mudayars, as we were saying, were particularly famous in Christian lands. So the Mudayars were Muslims and Jews that remained for centuries, like very large minorities in the Christian controlled territories of their conquista, famous for their archery, right? That were not necessarily crossbows, but mostly bows, but still, right? And in part because they had been disarmed. I mean, maybe some of them would have made use, paradoxically, more of things like crossbows. There are good anti-cavalry weapons, telling the truth. Spain has an important infantry tradition that is a bit underplayed, but also was never as important as as mounted warfare, telling the truth. And so this urban environment in particular would have witnessed to a use of crossbow, perhaps especially before the Christian arrival, and after that, like more sort of bows would have been kept as more sort of traditional arms here and there, if they were also tolerated in that case. Now, by around 1046, the Taifa kingdom of Islamic Zaragoza, as you know, at the time, a powerful independent Islamic state in the Ebro Valley before its conquest by Aragon in 1118, already maintained a detachment of 600 troops wielding the Akkara, with 2 cubes, a basic and complicated crossbow model that went on to define such weapons throughout the Western Islamic world, right? And so that was just, in this instance, like documented, also thanks to to exposure to Christian world, because we are drastically less documented about the broader Islamic world for different reasons. It was much less thriving socioeconomic reality than the West at this point. But it's also a matter of mentality and culture, really. But we see, indeed, that even that as far north as Zaragoza, of course, like the Muslims had these crossbows already, which is, I mean, the far north is also what you would more expect, considering that the Westerners already made consistent use of these weapons. All right. But we see the same pattern pretty much all across the board elsewhere in the Western Islamic world. And the word crossbows, I mean, as far as, again, Central Asia, all right, Ibn Mamun documented the persistence of diverse bow types, spanning age-old Hijazi and Arab patterns rooted in early Islamic Arabian designs, to contemporary Turkish cavalry designs influenced by steppe nomad archery. Certain composite bows that existed, by the way, in these areas since antiquity, because the broader sort of Mediterranean world, at least whatever had been controlled by the Byzantines, had an important composite tradition. Right, this is true also for certain parts of southern Italy at this point, at least, or at least it had been up to a few centuries before. In the Muslim world, it continues. Right, also in Spain. Certain composite bows excelled in particular settings. The same author highlighted, for example, that in Andalus's, quote, cold, damp environment characterized by the region's Mediterranean climate with wet winters, and mountainous humidity, versions emphasizing abundant horn, a moderate sinew component, and minimal wood offered superior performance. Right. Nevertheless, Ibn Maimun remained somewhat dismissive of crossbow overall, notwithstanding the rising prominence of their various forms, as we're seeing. In Western Islamic context, the Kavs al-Akkara labeled the, quote, 2-feet bow because it was typically spanned by placing both feet on a stirrup-like base. So, you know, the heavy employment during sieges, accompanied by other types like the Kavs al-Rijl, that is, the foot bow, foot drone for heavier draw weights, the Kavs al-Rikab, alternatively called Kavs afranji or, quote, stirrup bow, featuring a stirrup for easier spanning, the more substantial Jark, and the notably massive Kavs al-Lablab, which demanded a winch mechanism to draw. Ibn Udayl devoted considerable space in his texts to detailing crossbow construction, identifying the woods employed and underscoring the need for exact mathematical precision when fastening the bow element to the tiller or stock. The Islamic world had preserved a bit of that Hellenistic technologism. There are lots of interesting treatises, for example, in the Mamluk Sultanate that we also recently discussed. And I made a video about sort of the the Mamluk early handguns, right, that are very early, like earlier, obviously, in this period as well, the mid-fuzz, all right, with very beautiful illustrations that are not, naturally, they're medieval illuminations that maintain always a symbolic meaning, and we don't clearly understand, they're not manuals literally telling you how to build one, right, but there is that interest, right, in the technical side. And according to this author in question, a single extended strap made from male ibex leather fixed the stirrup in place, with cotton serving as the material for the strings. He further stressed the true proficiency in firing came chiefly from long-term hands-on practice paired with a smooth, deliberate trigger pull. Granadine warriors, it seems, routinely envenomed their crossbow bolts, right? Pretty nasty practice, widespread in different contexts, by fastening around the point a cloth fragment saturated in wolfsbane extract, a plant flourishing profusely across the nearby Sierra Nevada range, the high snowy mountains immediately south of Granada that you can see from the sea, that provided natural resources and defensive terrain. Artistic evidence preserves vivid images of these soldiers, and that's where we get to our source here, iconographically. One such depiction, in fact, appears in a fresco inside a modest residence situated in the El Partal section of the Alhambra. As you know, the magnificent Nasrid Palace Fortress complex in Granada began in the 13th century and expanded under various rulers as a symbol of royal power and artistry, created with distemper on whitewash and likely dating to roughly the mid-14th century. Right, this is today's source, the basis for the guy here. Among the most noticeable features are the helmet worn by, these. It's a list of figures, actually. You have this skull cap, essentially, with slightly more pointed. You have the forward positioned quiver on the saddle, used to hold his bolts in a container secured to the saddle itself. As we were hinting at before, even this, if this is not showed by the pictures, his remaining equipment could amount to different things, naturally, but possibly merely to a large dagger. So the lightweight helmet is also not this enormous thing, but you have, a dagger capable of sort of stabbing, cutting, sticking, especially that into the joints of plate armor at this point, starting to sort of become prevalent, right? Compared to mail, and also in the composition of the most advanced, in fact, plated panoply in general. Indications point to mounted crossbowmen of this kind, generally dismounting before combat as well, right? So the Nazarids, as we've seen from different sources, would be very skilled at fighting, also with the crossbow from horseback, but they would, especially think about the tough terrain around Granada, to dismount, to target an opponent as it was advancing, giving it a tough time, being able to withdraw easily, to pull out safely on horseback, right, and therefore slowing down with relatively small effort, even larger columns of advancing foes. Now, the aforementioned fresco additionally portrays lancers, that here we haven't represented. In any case, equipped with comparable helmets. These frescoes are not overwhelmingly, as we see also, I inserted some of the pictures here. First of all, in good shape, and the details of the art are also basically sketches of some sort. Like, there isn't this enormous depth to it, but they're still very sort of eloquent about what, in fact, Nasrid hosts would have looked like, especially the mounted side of the store. Further representations survive in a mid-14th century wall painting known as, quote, Army on the March, preserved in the Torre de las Damas, the Tower of the Ladies, part of the Alhambra's residential quarters, and in a painted leather ceiling dating to around 1380, located in the Sala de Justicia, the Hall of Justice, a key ceremonial space in the Alhambra. Granadan battlefield tactics in pitched engagements adhere to established patterns. Light cavalry units sought to break up and slow, as we were just saying, Christian advances directed at Moorish infantry lines. So this, if we're looking at indeed open field engagements, this could happen in different ways, right? But typically, Granadine horsemen opened with javelin volleys prior to switching to the sword for melee, because they had other jinetes essentially to fight against them, also into hand-to-hand combat, and they screened the main line, the heavies, or they sided them on the flanks. Quite versatile. Engagements unfolded typically via small bands relied on leather shields for the famous adargas, kidney-shaped kind of double shield for defense, and often pulled back before renewing their charges multiple times. Such crossbowmen appeared not only in Granada's own ranks, but also among allied or affiliated contingents in neighboring Marinid Morocco. The Berber dynasty ruling much of the Maghreb from the mid-13th to the 15th century, often intervening in Iberian affairs, as we were saying, to support Granada against Christian forces. Troop levies followed tribal structures, sourcing men mainly from the sovereign family's Banu Marin lineage or allied clans like the Banu and al-Bad. Provincial administration rested with ruling family members, each overseeing his own localized military, and additional privileged Andalusian cadre existed. Some formerly Mudayyars, or Muslims living under Christian dominion in reconquered territories, who benefited from elevated standing that shielded them from the factional rivalries fragmenting Moroccan tribal society. A specific historical reference describes the 14th century Marinid forces as encompassing even 1,500 goods Turkish cavalry. So mercenary horse archers of august Turkic origin, valued for their step-honed skills and often recruited across North African and Iberian Muslim armies. 4,000 European origin horsemen, so likely, as we were saying before, Christian mercenaries or converts. 500 European horse archers, maybe including mounted crossbowmen, here probably we're told so, who adopted Islam in this case, together with infantry archers, Andalusian crossbowmen, and 200 mounted crossbowmen hailing from Andalusia. All right, so this is, again, very interesting because you see, as we said at the beginning, actually pretty picked troops of, in this case, Andalusian extraction, regardless also of their ancestry that could be varied, right? You see Europeans in substantial numbers in the form of converts, but mostly like they were foreign mercenaries, right? I made some videos about this topic in particular. You will find some of that in the top fixed link down below. I'm glad also that we're expanding a bit more medieval North African warfare to an extent, because again, this Islamic rule, so regardless of the ferocious competitions and the rivalries that existed within it, straddled the same straits, right, and routinely injected these war bands from North Africa. But most of the influence for the mounted crossbow instead came from the north, came from the Christian world, came from the Western military organization, fighting styles, also technological development, right, and similar. But again, I'm glad that we are talking more, but you understand that I resumed a little bit the so-called sort of cycle extraction, we are making, this is our 9th video about the Al-Andalus, as a matter of fact. I don't think I have a Nasrid playlist yet, but we are talking more about this word. And I'm checking Islamic Spain. It's important for the sake of completion, right? I would say that without this, you can't quite appreciate the overall picture, right? These historical military units in particular render you more aware of the tactical variety, but also where the influxes came from, because otherwise you wouldn't necessarily say why do we have to talk about this, because it's a sort of an exception for the same Islamic world itself, right? And there is a massive Western Christian presence in here, so it's unavoidable in Nazarid arms and armor, right? As far as the military historical unit series, well, it's been a driver. Let's say not a channel's driver, but considering the specificity, right? Let's see if historical military units is 165th video, and probably doesn't make so many views now. And if we talk about the one about medieval military units, which is the largest of all, more, 218. So this is also very interesting because, yeah, from last year also we made a bit more Islamic units. They came up anyway from the general extraction, but it really made a lot. Again, I'm really satisfied, even though these playlists, the playlist views have only relatively to do with the individual videos views. Obviously not equivalent. It doesn't, the playlist view does not equate to the sum of the views of the single videos. It has nothing to do with that. It counts only the times the playlist is clicked on, and then the videos are another thing, right? So I don't know how interesting this stuff is. I realize that here and there when I make videos about, I don't know, Muslim warfare or something. For example, recently I made that video. It was actually pretty well done about the Ayyubid Mamluk of the 1240s, right? But it's they are important topics, right? They may have been more appealing historically for the earlier years of the channel, where people did not properly make all this stuff. I don't remember which channel made something like Units of History kind of series, but I stopped seeing them being done, probably because they weren't so thrilling for people. I don't know why, because it's more like not a story, it's something you think mostly material. Yeah, I remember now which one it did this. And yeah, it this channel, by the way, this is a really big channel. It keeps making videos. Yes, but not so many, as a matter of fact. So lots of views indeed, but also shorter videos, and with a very important gap, right? So I was just curious to see how many units of history video. 38. Yeah, in fact, the last ones are relatively old. Yeah, even from years old. But the idea is important because, again, these units of history must have some general appeal, again, for the completion of the picture. I'm also glad that we're talking more about medieval Iberian warfare. This is the 28th video about, so this doesn't seem so, but like it grew during the years, and it's also an important picture to be reached, right? So as far as today's video, you understood, again, the importance of this specific unit in the specific context of the Sierra Nevada, of the Nazarid realm, and more. The Western influence, the very strong resemblance, especially in units like this, of Nazarid military culture to broader Western influence. And what can we say? We go on, right? We have our schedule, we have our topics to cover. Schwerpunkt has always gone on, and it's important to do so, right? For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.